if you want to look at it from an energy security perspective, and frankly, that is how I generally see it in Asia, which is why it's a nice place to be a sustainability analyst. I think the conversations here are very pragmatic, and economies understand that having a diverse source of energy that is not part of a global market and not subject to geopolitical crises is extremely important.
Hello from Hong Kong and welcome to Under the Banyan Tree. I'm Fred Newman, Chief Asia Economist here at HSBC.
And I'm Herald van der Linde, Head of Asia Equity Strategy. As volatility and uncertainty around the Middle East conflict continues, we're asking a new question today. What impact could the situation have for renewables?
That's right. Asia is a massive energy importer, but it's also a major player in the energy transition. So the question is, could the supply squeeze help jumpstart the green agenda again?
Joining us to help answer that is Nneka Chike-Obi from our Sustainability Research Team. Nneka is based here in Hong Kong and looks exclusively at Asia Pacific.
Indeed, we're looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Let's get the conversation started right here under the Banyan Tree. A few stats first off to put things into context. We said Asia was highly energy dependent, and we weren't kidding. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are all 100% dependent on fossil fuel imports. And when it comes to liquid natural gas, 80% of Qatar's entire production comes to Asia.
That's right, Fred. But at the same time, green power is on the rise. 35% of electricity across Asia Pacific is generated by non-fossil fuel sources. For comparison, Europe is at nearly 50% and the US is at less than 25%. Fred, here we are. We've talked about the issues in the Middle East and the impact on Asia in previous podcasts. We looked at higher oil prices, the second round consequences on interest rates and these sort of things. Remind me quickly, Asia is really energy dependent, right? Where are the pockets? Which countries are mostly
Asia is hugely exposed to disruptions in global oil and gas markets. It's absolutely clear. Even though Asian economies have been quite good at reducing their energy intensity. In fact, over the last 20 years, the energy used to generate GDP has declined by about 30%, which is quite big. But yet we need a lot of oil and gas, particularly from the Middle East. So there are about 9 economies across Asia that receive more than 70% of the oil imports from the Gulf, which is obviously a huge vulnerability for them. And when we look at gas, here too, there are a number of economies where gas is a very important generator for electricity, for example. More than 50% of all the energy use comes from gas in places like Thailand, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia. So these are economies that are quite exposed to any supply disruptions. So with that dependence on the Middle East, oil and gas from the Middle East, that exposure, and of course countries thinking more about national energy security, would that kind of renew the interest perhaps in the renewable sector? And of course, what are markets telling us? Do you see perhaps already investors looking at this, the implications for renewables?
Absolutely, Fred. So what we've seen is that when oil prices went up, oil companies listed in the markets, they can sell oil now at a higher price, so their profits go up. So these companies' share prices have gone up. The market cap of these companies have gone up as well. But the market capitalization of the combined battery producers in Asia has gone up even more. It's about $70 billion since the start of this particular conflict. So clearly the markets say, hey, there is something there with these battery companies. Now, that has partially maybe also been ignited by new batteries come to the market. BYD, the leading electric vehicle company in China, they've come with a new battery pack whereby it allows you to charge your car in 5 minutes, 80% full, and 9 to 11 minutes, depending on how cold it is, completely full.
So that says you could drink a cup of coffee and your car would be fully charged.
Absolutely.
Just as putting gas in the tank.
Exactly. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're actually installing 20,000 charging stations across China as we speak. And apparently they have plans to do exactly the same in Europe. So you can then drive around, charge in a few minutes, cup of coffee done, and you drive another few hundred kilometers before you charge again, just like you do in a petrol car. So there's clearly an interest in this, and we're moving in this particular direction. situation.
But I think we need a bit more context, and probably
Absolutely.
it's a good time to bring in our sustainability guru for Asia. Nneka, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nneka.
Hi, guys.
So, Nneka, you've looked obviously at sustainability and energy issues for a long time across Asia. How do you think about the implications of the current energy shock for the energy mix in Asia, and particularly renewables?
So when we look at what we call the nationally determined contribution, which is what governments submit to the UN for their commitments to reaching Paris Agreement targets in 2050 of net zero, energy security is mentioned very regularly by many of the large Asian economies. So we see it in the plans for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan will mention specifically issues around energy security.
And this was already before the energy shock. They
Before
already
this
thought
current
about
shock.
it. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As you mentioned before, a lot of the large economies in Asia are dependent on energy imports, places like Japan and South Korea. So for them, they were already looking at decarbonization as an opportunity to reduce their dependence on imports and generate power domestically. So this kind of supports the thesis that we've seen from the policy perspective that's been going back to sort of 2015. And this is sort of a validation of it. In terms of what this potentially means for the energy mix, we looked back at what happened in the the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022. We took a look at the spreads between gas and solid fossil fuels in Asia. The spreads were actually significantly larger in 2022, particularly in the summer of 2022.
So gas was relatively more expensive than, say, traditional fossil fuels at that particular point in time. So this is not as much as a crisis as it was in
Exactly.
the past.
So the relative expense of gas vis-a-vis alternatives is not as great right now. And so this leads to the question of what will these economies use as an alternative to gas? Because 80% of the LNG that comes out of Qatar goes to Asia, right? So we're looking at a situation where it's not just a price issue, it's also a supply issue. There is going to need to be energy generated from something else other than natural gas.
Now, let's take a look at a couple of these new supplies, in particular solar and wind. That seems to be the energy sources that most countries are focusing on. Is that correct?
And maybe to put this in context, how much is actually being generated at the moment by renewables going into this? Because we read a lot about these massive investments, but is it fair to say that it's still really maximum 15%? I mean, we have some economies. I think New Zealand has very high share, I think almost half. But then you get quickly down to Philippines, 19%, other countries around 10, 11%.
You're talking about alternatives in total or solar and wind?
Solar and wind and renewables more broadly in the energy mix for these countries. So, yes, there is investment, but it's still a relatively small share. Is that a fair characterization?
I would say it's fair that if you look at the installed capacity for renewable power generation, it's much ahead of the actual generation. And that could be a combination of continuing to use existing power plants that maybe are coming towards the end of their life. So, for example, South Korea has a very ambitious plan to retire large amounts of energy from traditional fossil fuel plants, and those will have to be replaced by either renewables or some alternative fuel. So,
but does that mean the plants are already there? The solar panels are installed. They're just waiting to turn them on. And is this an opportunity then to actually ramp it up quite quickly?
Yeah. So I actually took a look to see what the capacity utilization was for wind and solar in most of the large Asian economies. And in most cases, they are underutilized. India might be the one with the most underutilization. At the moment, 50% of installed power capacity in India is renewables, but it's only around 20% of generation. So in some senses, you can see that as an opportunity in a crisis like this for economies to have the option to switch to renewables because there is excess capacity available.
So that's
in the
good
system.
news because that is already installed, say, solar panels that they are not fully utilizing. So for whatever reason, you would expect them to do so. In addition to that, across the whole solar food chain, there seems to be oversupply as well. So even if you would run into capacity problems, you need a module or you need a panel. There is plenty of that around, in particular in China at the moment, right?
Yes. Another thing to consider is when you look at the efficiency of solar, the installation of battery energy storage systems increases their efficiency because you have the opportunity to store solar power.
This comes back to this sort of BYD story that these batteries are getting better.
Exactly. So as the battery technology becomes better and cheaper, it improves the efficiency. So if you look at a typical capacity utilization of a solar panel is around 25%. So that means 25% of the day the panel can generate electricity. And that's because of
Well, it makes sense.
cloud
Half the
cover.
day, of course, in a cloud cover, it makes sense.
Exactly.
Yes.
You can increase that significantly through battery storage. At the moment, we have battery storage systems that are around 4 to 6 hours, but there's actually been some interesting news in the U.S. of some new battery types that could potentially, in terms of a grid-scale battery, store 100 hours of power.
So it's interesting. You mentioned that actually we have already much more capacity than we're using, so it's really about turning that capacity on. Batteries are going to be a key part of that. But beyond that, isn't there scope then that should double down even more on reliance on some of these renewable sources just to get away from imports of fossil fuels, because it's a national security issue if these economies want to continue to work? Do you see that potentially happening?
And if I can add to that, wind, for example, very often is in places far away. So batteries are playing a maybe even more important role with wind as well.
Yes, and wind, if you look at the time to sort of activate, solar is the fastest and solar is the cheapest compared to wind. And then when you talk about other renewables like hydro or geothermal, longer scale, more capital intensive. If you want to look at it from an energy security perspective, and frankly, that is how I generally see it in Asia, which is why it's a nice place to be a sustainability analyst. I think the conversations here are very pragmatic, and economies understand that having a diverse source of energy and energy that you can control within your own borders, that is not part of a global market and not subject to geopolitical crises, is extremely important from a stability perspective. And so this kind of creates the story for renewable energy outside of simply doing something better for the earth and reducing carbon emissions.
So just to put this very quickly together, there is enough solar installed for the moment in order to quickly switch into that. And if we need more, there's supply as well. Wind probably as well takes a bit longer, but the battery technology is key here, and that allows us to utilize these sources much better. Then, of course, there's nuclear as well, right? Is that something we can quickly start up as well?
Nuclear has a much longer lead time. And in most of the economies that already have nuclear installed and had shifted away from it after the 2011 crisis at Fukushima, there is a process of putting nuclear back onto the system. Japan's 2050 net zero strategy requires it to have around 25% of its electricity generated by nuclear. At the moment, it's around 15%. But this is going to be done by putting plants that have been idled back online. In terms of brand new nuclear, that is very expensive and has a much longer lead time.
And there's this new sort of trend of small modular reactors, right? Smaller nuclear reactors that you can use in cities or in data centers. Is that right?
That would probably be considered an earlier scale technology in terms of the maturity. At the moment, there's a lot of investment coming from the technology sector, as you mentioned, related to data centers for small modular reactors. I've also heard about some potential uses for maritime, for example, as a replacement for fuel oil. But in terms of grid scale electricity, I think that's probably unlikely at the moment, just based on the economics of nuclear SMRs.
But Herald, I feel a little bit better now, I have to say. We talk, obviously the tragic war in the Middle East and all the worrying consequences for Asia and the disruptions to lives and the economies. But it does appear that sometimes also this can be an impetus for change. And I
there
think
seems to be some buffer and
flexibility. There are technologies available. We have capacity. We actually have a capacity we need to bring on. So maybe that accelerates a little bit the process towards things like renewables, and will make economies just more resilient against some future shocks. So, Nneka, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll make sure that we'll check in with you again very soon to see where we are in terms of the energy transition.
Thank you, Nneka.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. Thanks for joining us. And remember to listen, like, and subscribe to Under the Banyan Tree and our sister podcast, The Macro Brief, if you haven't already.
Under the Banyan Tree is an HSBC Global Investment Research production. Our producer here is Graham Mackay. We'll talk to you again very soon.